Hello everyone, welcome to our channel, The Secret Net. Before we start our story, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. Also, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone could leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from around the world. So grab a blanket, get into your coziest bed, and let's explore the 5 most terrifying Home Alone stories that will keep you up all night. One night when I was about 15, my parents were out for the evening, and I was home alone in our apartment in Manhattan. The city never really sleeps, but our neighborhood was relatively quiet. It was late, around midnight, and I was watching a movie in the living room. Our apartment was on the 10th floor of an older building. We had a solid door with a peephole and a chain lock, but it wasn't uncommon to hear noises from the hallway or the neighbors. I was deeply engrossed in the movie when I suddenly heard a faint tapping sound. At first I thought it was part of the film, but then it grew louder and more insistent. I paused the movie and listened closely. The sound was coming from the front door. I felt a chill run down my spine. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole but saw nothing, just the empty hallway. I convinced myself it was just a trick of my imagination and went back to the couch. A few minutes later, the tapping started again, this time louder and more urgent. My heart pounded as I approached the door again, this time with a kitchen knife in hand. I looked through the peephole, but again saw nothing. Suddenly, the tapping turned into a loud bang, as if someone was trying to force the door open. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing through all the possibilities. Was it a neighbor? A random person? A burglar? The door banged again, harder this time. I backed away slowly, trying to think of what to do. My parents were at a dinner party and wouldn't be home for hours. I didn't have a cell phone, and the landline was in the kitchen, far from the front door. I took a deep breath, gathered all my courage, and shouted. "Who's there?" My voice echoed in the quiet apartment. There was a moment of silence. Then I heard a muffled voice say, "Maintenance." "We got a report of a gas leak." Relief washed over me, but I was still cautious. "Why didn't you say so earlier?" I demanded, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He knocked, but no one answered. "We need to check the gas lines," the voice replied. I still wasn't sure if I should open the door, but the thought of a gas leak was terrifying. I decided to call the building's management office to confirm the maintenance. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the phone, and dialed the emergency number. The person who answered told me they hadn't sent anyone up for a gas leak. My blood ran cold. I was right to be scared. I hung up and hurried back to the front door. The banging had stopped, but I could hear someone talking in hushed tones outside. I took another deep breath and yelled, "I've called the police. They're on their way." I heard hurried footsteps, and then silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity before peering through the peephole again. The hallway was empty. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, every noise making me jump. My parents came home to find me wide awake, clutching the knife. I told them everything, and my dad called the building security. They checked the security cameras and saw 2 men trying to pick the lock on our door before my shout scared them off. The building installed better locks and security cameras on every floor after that night. Even now, years later, I double-check all the locks before I go to bed. That night in Manhattan taught me to always trust my instincts and be prepared for anything. I was either in 7th or 8th grade at the time when one evening I got creeped out. No, it was beyond creepy. I was scared, and that scared me more. Country, or mountain kids learn to cope with all sorts of problems that city kids wouldn't know how to deal with. But when it comes to weird human behavior, we are often at a loss. My parents loved to play cards. They were part of a circle of friends that met at different houses, had potluck dinner, and played cards for the rest of the evening. I usually went with them, but that evening I was getting over some kind of flu bug. I was camped out on the living room couch, reading a book. I had asked Mama to close the curtains that faced me because the sun was in my eyes. I was still weak, and getting up was an effort. Mama did close the curtain for me, which was a big help later on. It was still daylight when my parents left. The late afternoon sun was pouring in the back windows. My cat Whiskers was draped over the back of a chair, dozing in a warm sunspot. My old dog Julie was in a similar sunspot on the living room rug. I was reading my book, and all was right with the world, peacefully and quiet. Well, I must have dozed off. I woke up startled to hear my cat hissing and my dog growling. I never heard her growl like that before, that low rumble that still continues with the intake of breath. Julie had moved over to stand stiffly next to me, facing the front door. Well, I could see the door knob moving. Fortunately, the deadbolt above the knob was locked. I was still kind of befuddled when I heard someone moving to the kitchen window. They must have had sand on their shoes because I could hear the crunchy noise when they stepped across the porch to the window. I was instantly awake. It was fully dark at that point. All the curtains were still open, except the one Mama closed for me. The only light on was the one I had been reading under. I might as well have been under a spotlight, but I was in a nightgown. I had gotten hot, so had untied the wrap rope which had slid open. I was in a jam. What to do? Before whoever it was got to the window, I rolled off the couch and flattened myself against it. We had an old cedar chest as a coffee table at that time. I pulled up my legs so I couldn't be seen from the window. Billy was barking wildly now, and the cat had gone under something. I had to move. I would be in full view from the next window. I got up dizzy and moved across the living room where the curtain was closed, toward the phone. My dog was now leaping at one of the windows, with her teeth bared and barking. Whoever it was wasn't leaving. I had a hunch they knew I was alone. I didn't know how long they had been looking in before the dog started to growl. But what really spooked me was a barking dog wasn't scaring them off. There wasn't anyone around to hear my dog. The campground close to us was closed for the winter. We had the only house amongst weekend cabins. Unfortunately, it was Wednesday. I had got to the phone by moving along the wall. At one point, I was pressed up against the wall, under the window that he was looking into. Yes, I was sure it was a man, from the height and across the shoulders of the jacket, that I glimpsed when he moved away from one of the other windows, but I lifted the phone and realized it was dead. At the same time, I heard the back door being tried. I froze for a minute because the back door had a glass window. I was dizzy and starting to panic when I remembered that my stepdad had a different phone line put into his office at the other end of the house. I got up and ran down the hallway with my dog and into his office. Locked the door behind me just in case. Thank goodness that phone was okay. I called my stepdad at the house they were playing cards at. It was only a mile away. The sheriff's station was on the other side of the lake. I needed someone to come fast. It took me a while to get him to understand with the dog barking, and I'm a blithering idiot at this point. Well, I finally yelled help. Come now. Someone is breaking in. They have cut the other phone line. If they get in, I'm going out another door and hide outside. I was so dizzy, everything was moving. I sat down on the floor, under his desk, where I wouldn't be seen from the window, and hoped I wouldn't have to run outside. My dog found me and stood guard over me. She was no longer barking. but her hackles were still up, and her lips were curved away from her teeth. That frightened me more than when she was barking. It was like she knew not to draw attention to where I was. Well, it seemed like forever, but it was just a few minutes when I heard a siren. Turns out some of the people my parents were playing cards with were deputies. Daddy and one deputy came into the house to find me, while a couple of guys and a deputy looked around outside. People is shaking, cold with shock, and the office wasn't heated, so I was just plain old cold. The window on the back door had been broken out. There was blood on it. The guy cut himself on it. The doorknob lock had been opened, but the dead bolt on that door was one you had to open with a key, so the guy couldn't get in. They caught the guy the next day. He went to the doctor's office for stitches. He got a relapse of the flu bug. Gee, I wonder why. Well, after that, all curtains were closed at sunset. Yes, I stayed home alone. Again. I wasn't going to let some jackass ruin my life by making me scared. My older sibling and I were staying at home in a small town in Ohio with fewer people in it than my mom's graduating class from the city we came from. My sibling was grounded, and both the house phone and their own phone were locked in my dad's gun safe, which neither of us had the combination to. The reason for being grounded was something silly and arbitrary. I can't quite remember why. My grandparents lived down the street, and my great-grandmother lived in a small house they had built for her on the property, so she could be independent but still be close by. My parents said they were going to check on my great-grandmother, as my grandparents were out of town that day, and then they would come back and we would order pizza. That sounded good enough to 7-year-old me and 14, 15-year-old sibling. We played video games for a while, starting to get hungry and wondering when my parents would be back. Well, after about 2 hours of them being gone, I heard a knock on the door. I went downstairs, pretty excited for the food, and my sibling followed a bit behind after saving the game. We walked up to the door, which had a large window in it, and it wasn't my parents. It was a very tall, lean, white guy with short black hair and scruffy facial hair. About 24 or 25 years old. This was jarring because everyone knew everyone in this small town, and I had no clue who this was. I held up my finger like 1 second and closed the curtain. I turned to see my siblings staring at the door, in disbelief because they had seen the person too. In seconds, the knocking turned to pounding, then to shaking and rattling our doorknob. Terrified and with no way to call our parents, my sibling grabbed my hand and ran me into the kitchen. They grabbed a knife, and I distinctly remember it breaking in their hand, so they grabbed a different one. We hid in the laundry room and held each other, hearing banging, pounding, and about 5 minutes that felt like hours later, the front door opening. One thing about my sibling is that they have always been ready to protect me at a moment's notice, and they were ready to jump up with their broken kitchen knife and defend me the moment the guy was upon us. Instead, my mom rounded the corner, holding 2 pizza boxes, and wondering why her 2 kids were in a crumpled heap of tears on the floor. We both stood up and ran to tell her about the man outside, but we were met with laughter. My dad was outside talking to him. She said that he was asking about buying a broken-down car that had been in our driveway for a few months and was apparently a mechanic. My mom felt terrible, but found the situation a bit amusing. Apparently she went out and told the man, and he said he felt bad for scaring us. Else we were given hugs and promised that the phones wouldn't be locked away while they were gone again. And we spent the evening eating our pizza with choked sobs. But something still bothers me, even though it didn't as a child. Something that I just never thought about. Why would an adult man pound on the door like that, shake the handle, and try his very hardest to get into a house where either the parents weren't home or the youngest child had held up their finger, like 1 second to go get their parent. Why would someone want to talk about a car that didn't have any sort of for sale sign on it so late at night, around 9 or 10 p.m.? I'd like your opinion on whether I was actually in danger that night, as my parents brushed it off so lightly. But something in my gut, as an adult now, tells me that's not the way adults act. And I don't think I would want to know what would have happened had my parents not come home when they did. I lived in a condo, and one night I was abruptly woken up by the sound of someone rattling my front doorknob. As far as I knew, no one had keys to my condo except me. The door then creaked open, and I heard footsteps coming inside. My heart raced. I was 100% sure I was being robbed. In a full adrenaline rush, I leapt out of bed and sprinted toward the front door, shouting, "Get out of here!" However, my scream came out as a garbled mess, given I had been sound asleep just seconds before, and now had adrenaline surging through my veins. I was literally jumping around in my underwear, flailing my arms, when I realized that the two guys standing at my front door looked more terrified than I had ever seen anyone. One of the guys, his hands visibly shaking, held out a set of keys and explained that his friend had given him the keys to his place and told him he could stay there while he was out of town. It turned out that his friend lived directly above me, and these guys had mistakenly gone to the wrong floor. The floors and condo units weren't numbered, so they didn't realize they were at the wrong door. The keys were similar enough that they could open my door, and I could have opened theirs with my keys. Needless to say, the next day I was standing outside the hardware store, waiting for it to open so I could buy a new lock for my door. Hello, it was a chilly autumn evening in a quiet suburb in California. I was 12 and home alone for the weekend, while my parents were out of town visiting relatives. Our house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by tall trees that cast eerie shadows in the moonlight. It was around 10 p.m., and I was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves outside and the occasional creak of the house settling. I had locked all the doors and windows, as my parents had instructed, but I still felt a bit uneasy. Suddenly, I heard a faint noise coming from the back of the house. It sounded like a soft tapping. I brushed it off, thinking it was probably just a tree branch against the window, but the tapping continued, growing louder and more persistent, while I put down my book and listened closely. The sound was definitely coming from the kitchen. My heart started to race as I tiptoed towards the kitchen, trying to make as little noise as possible. I peered around the corner and saw nothing unusual. Well, the back door was locked, and the windows were shut tight. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the kitchen chairs was slightly pulled out from the table. I was certain I had pushed it in earlier. I slowly backed out of the kitchen, my mind racing. Had someone been in the house? Were they still here? I grabbed my cell phone and dialed my parents' number, but there was no answer. I decided to call the police, but just as I was about to hit the call button, the tapping sound started again, this time louder and coming from the basement door. Well, I had always hated the basement. It was dark, damp, and filled with old furniture and boxes of forgotten belongings. The door to the basement was slightly ajar, which was odd because I never went down there. With my phone in one hand and the kitchen knife in the other, I approached the basement door. The tapping grew louder, and I could now hear a faint, almost inaudible whispering. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I gathered all my courage, pushed the door open, and flicked on the basement light. The stairs creaked as I slowly descended. About halfway down, the light flickered and then went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight and turned it on. The narrow beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the old furniture and dusty boxes. The whispering had stopped, but the tapping continued, now sounding more like scratching. I aimed the flashlight towards the far corner of the basement and nearly dropped my phone in shock. There, crouched in the corner, was a figure. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothes, his eyes wide and wild, while he was scratching at the wall with long, dirty fingernails. I screamed and ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I locked it and called the police, barely able to speak through my panic. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me until the officers arrived. The police searched the basement and found the man still crouched in the corner, muttering to himself. He was a homeless man who had somehow gotten into the house, probably through a basement window that had been left unlocked. He had been living there for days, undetected. The officers took him away, and I spent the rest of the night at a neighbor's house. My parents cut their trip short and came home the next day. We had the locks changed and installed security cameras around the house. To this day, the sound of tapping makes my skin crawl, and I can't go near a basement without feeling a wave of fear. That night taught me to always be vigilant and never take my safety for granted.